going on, everybody? Welcome back to this week's Lumix Live. We've got a whole lot of information to talk about today. As you've seen from the title, this is the GH6 from the filmmaker's perspective. So, covered photography last week. If you're interested in the photography stuff and you want to hear more about it, take a look at last week's video, after you finish watching this one, of course. And we cover a whole bunch of info there about photography tools, how the camera works. But today, knowing that the vast majority of the users here really focus on the videography and the filmmaking side of the GH6, we're covering everything. So if you have questions, we probably have most, if not all, of the answers. If you're new to these live streams, these are the weekly broadcasts that we do every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on the Lumix Cameras channel, to basically just provide a platform where you can interact directly with Lumix as a whole. So today is actually one of the kind of more fun streams. We've got Matt Frazer joining us as well, so he'll be jumping in a few minutes. And basically just have a hour-ish long conversation with us. So if you have questions, make sure to tag at Lumix Cameras, as a number of people are doing already in the chat. This way we can see them, and then we can address them as we go through the stream. Primarily, like we said, this conversation is going to be about the videography and the filmmaking side of it. So questions that are going to be focused primarily on that are what we're going to be focusing on answering. But if you have other questions about the GH6, feel free to drop them in here. If we don't get to them this week, we'll probably get to them over the next couple of weeks of streams that we're doing. There is just so much to talk about with the GH6, and we know that we're going to be, having a lot of conversations. So, before we go too far into this, I want to cover some of the basic stuff that we normally do. If you're not already doing so, make sure to head over to the Instagram channel for Lumix USA and give us a follow. We are continuing the conversation there. We're showing off some really cool content from creators like yourself. And that's really kind of a core piece of what our Instagram account is about. We want to be able to share and show content that's created by users, by actual in-the-field working photographers and videographers. So head over there, check out some of the cool stuff we've got going on. If you want to continue these conversations, you can drop into our DMs, and we can try to continue conversations there. Otherwise, we will be also taking questions and stuff through our email address. So if you shoot us an email to lumixlive@us.panasonic.com, we collect a running tab of questions that get submitted through that platform to come up with content as we move forward. So, yeah, plenty of ways to get yourself questions and conversations going on with myself and others here at Lumix USA. Let's see here. For those that are unaware, we have Lumix Pro services here in the United States and abroad. In the United States, we have two tiers. We have the Red and the Platinum tier. The Red tier is a free membership plan that gets you coverage for your camera, pretty much no matter what Lumix camera you've purchased, as long as it's on the list. That's going to get you your 3-year extended warranty here in the United States. It gets you the program access for upgrading to things like Platinum if you want. It also lets you get into information about things like events like this that we've got going on, maybe local events that are starting to come back here in the United States. So if you're not already, make sure to go get your camera registered over there. Like I said, it's free. But then we have the Platinum series of our service. So Lumix Pro Platinum is a paid tier version of our support system. That system also does get you your 3-year extended warranty. It gets you an exclusive member hotline during normal business hours, Monday through Friday, where you can actually call in and speak to a representative with Panasonic Lumix to get support on your equipment if needed. You also get 2-day turnaround times with next-day shipping for free both ways if you happen to have to send your camera in, or you want to send your camera in for maintenance. You also have 20% off out-of-warranty repairs, so if you drop a camera, break a lens, anything along those lines, you get a discount on the service that would be required to correct and calibrate those. You also get sensor cleanings, lens calibrations, all that fun stuff throughout the year as well. And then you also get a really cool welcome gift that's Peak Design customized strap for the LPS system. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure to take a look at either the QR codes that were up on the screen just before, or you can take a look at the links down below. If you're not in the United States, we also have the global portal for Lumix Pro services, so you can check what's available in your region, and then see what tiers they have available for your particular country. Last but not least, well, actually, I can wait on this, because there was a whole bunch of firmware updates that came out, and we're going to be talking about those throughout this particular stream, so we'll drop some links into the chat for that. So, with that, I think let's bring Matt Frazer into here. Hi, Matt. How are you?
Hi, Sean. I'm doing well. How are you?
Coming down off a crazy last week, right? You know, it's so much going on.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. We haven't done much. No,
Yeah.
not much introduction.
Yeah, just this little tiny thing, you know, the GH6 launching. So, you know,
Yeah,
as you can probably see if you're watching the chat too, I mean, there are tons of questions here. So,
yeah,
I think we can just jump right into this. What do you say?
yeah. Let's get in the questions first, and then we can, if we run out of questions to answer, we can present a few things that we think are cool. Maybe some stuff that's not getting covered as closely as we were hoping, stuff like that.
Yeah, cool. So, one of the first questions that we have here came from, I think it's Lindrick. It's asking, can you talk about the frame rates and menu options when you're in the 24 hertz cinema mode on the GH6? For
That is that's some terrific questions because I don't ever use the 24 hertz mode. I'm always at 2398. So step one is to locate where we change the system frequency. So let me just do that really quick, and then we can start answering some questions.
Yeah, so while Matt's doing that, for those that don't know, the Lumix GH6 offers 3 different regions of operation in the camera no matter where you buy it. So you have your NTSC system, you have a PAL system, and then you have Cinema 24 hertz. Most people associate 24p or 24 frames per second with the more common 23.98. But in this case, we're talking about cinema, so that's true 24.00 as your frame rate. And in some cases, that changes what frame rates are available, what aspect ratios might be available. So yeah, it looks like, Matt, you have the camera set up. So
you have questions, I have answers. So
yeah.
when we set it to true 24, so just again to make sure everybody understands, you know, in PAL regions, there's 50 hertz standard. That's the lighting in people's homes. They're cycling at 50 frames a second. We tried to set up television standards so that we can run at that 50 frames a second for the camera. It helps to reduce flicker and other challenges. Sometimes 25 frames, sometimes 50 frames. In the United States, we use 60 frames, and because we're Americans, we have to make things complicated. So our video standard is actually 5994, and so that helps to eliminate the flickering. And then we have a 24 frame version for 5994 that's called 23.976. The camera will say 23.98. And that's what we use as an integer. It's like 2.5 time integer of our television standard in the United States. So true 24 is typically for cinema. It's used for a in-theater presentation. You can absolutely upload this to YouTube if you'd like, but typically we use this only for cinematic presentation. And the video codecs, obviously you can use MOV and you can use MP4, but what quality options you have will all be integers of 24. So you'll have access to like 4K 24 and Cinema 4K 24, Cinema 4K 48. You'll have access to 24 5.7K. You'll have access to 4K 120. And then you can still go into VFR in certain settings. So you still have the full VFR access as well. But if you want the native like high frame rate codecs, they have to be integers of 24. So we're not going to give you access to like the 30 frame or 60 frame option when you set it to true 24.
Yeah. Yeah. So, cool. Yeah. I think that kind of basically just covers what's available for 24 hertz. Pretty much fairly standard to what we've been doing on cameras like the GH5, GH5S, S1H, any camera that has that 24 hertz option. It's just when you start getting to some of those higher frame rates. So here, next question came in from Cliff. GH6 and 4K and 1080p crop factors for one-to-one read windows. Looking to see how much his 300 millimeter would reach out. So for those that want to maybe a little more simplify to that, there's a pixel-to-pixel readout option on the GH6, which will read out just the pixel-to-pixel, so 1920 by 1080 or 3840 by 2160 or 4096 by 2160, and it won't use the full sensor width to read that out. So Matt, before the stream, I know we were talking a little bit about what the kind of crop ratio would be. Do you know, have that number, what that is?
Kind of. So we can go into this. So keep in mind the camera's going to use the full sensor width. That's 5,760 pixels. That's the sensor width that we're using. I realized that it's actually a little less resolution when we're in when we're in the 16:9 ratio. It's a little less resolution than that. That has more to do with what we're capturing and storing in order to get higher frame rates, things like that. Just assume you have 5760 pixels wide. This makes it pretty easy for us to factor what sort of crop we're going to get, because effectively it's an integer of 1920. So when we go from 5.7K, which would be the full sensor width, and we choose pixel for pixel, and we're shooting in 4K at 3840 by 2160, well, we're going to subtract exactly 1920 pixels. So it goes from 5.7K down to 3840. So it's about a 33% crop. If we do a crop once again to pixel for 1080, that's going to be an additional 50% crop on top of that. So that should give you a rough idea of where the crops will end up. So you're going to have a 600 millimeter lens on your 300 millimeter if you're shooting 1080, give or take, if my math is right. And I had to do this on the fly while Cliff was asking the question. So hopefully that gives you an answer, Cliff, that you can work with.
Yeah. Well, cool. Let's see. Another follow-up question here was actually a question about ProRes LT. For those that don't know, we have already announced that we will be adding Cinema 4K as well as Full HD in ProRes and ProRes LT, or not LT, ProRes 422 and ProRes 422 HQ, so that it's not just the 5.7K option available. But this question has come up a couple of times, referencing why we're not putting ProRes LT into the camera. Do you have any kind of info on that, Matt? Or as to why?
So first off, let's say, let's first off just say we've asked for ProRes LT to see if it's something that they could add in a future firmware update, because we do understand the benefits of working in LT, both in terms of file size, but really it's in terms of the editing and how it will work on your computer. In reality, we're very proud of our all intra codecs that we incorporate in the camera. So if you need smaller file sizes, we feel that the image quality is better from our own codecs. It's once we start to get to the higher data rates of ProRes that we begin to get some of the ProRes advantages in terms of image quality, or at least motion cadence. But the fact of the matter is that we just think the image looks better if you use our 400 megabit or 800 megabit or 600 megabit all intra codecs that are in the camera. So I believe that's probably why the engineers made the decision that they did. But we'll continue to ask for ProRes LT, because again, if you're shooting, primarily static objects like what I'm shooting here, ProRes LT would be perfectly acceptable for this. If I'm trying to shoot somebody surfing on an ocean, I may not want to work with ProRes LT. I may want to work with a Panasonic codec or one of the higher quality codecs from Apple. So There you go. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it's interesting to also point out with the GH6 that, up until this camera, the highest data rate we had for our own codecs was up to 400 megabits per second. Now with this camera, we're adding 600 and 800 megabit, which also have all intra variants. So you get some of that benefit of, much higher data rate for the actual file to work with. They're all intra, so less demanding on external hardware, for laptops, or not laptops, desktops and graphics cards as I'm staring at it. And honestly, I can tell you, playing around with all the different variants, at least on my Windows-based machines here, every single one of them seems to be just cutting on a timeline like butter. Although I'm not layering so many different things all on one timeline. So definitely
I
exciting.
can I can tell I can tell you that on a previous generation Mac Mini, because my kid had to shoot some stuff and he shot on a GH6 for school. Um, he uh, maybe some of the 4K all inter codecs and IPB codecs are a little harder on my previous generation Mac Mini versus the current generation M1s. So I can definitely see some benefits for ProRes, depending on the age and generation of your computer and how much GPU acceleration you have.
Yeah.
That clear as day, there's certainly advantages.
Yeah. So let's see here. The next question we got here is what resolution settings can you use the pixel to pixel option with? And well, we already talked about what the magnification is in 1080, 4K, in those modes, and can it be used with 240 and 300 frames per second?
So
I know you
so
were just looking at this.
yeah, so pixel for pixel won't work in five. Well, technically it does work in 5.7K because you're getting the full pixel per pixel. There's no additional crop. So there you go. Same with the 5.8K. But I think what you're asking is like at if we go to like 4K, can we do the pixel for pixel crop? Yes, you absolutely can. Up to a frame rate of 120 frames per second. Same if you were to do full high definition and you want to do a pixel for pixel crop, so you get a really tight angle on the sensor for more, reach. Again, you'd be limited to 120 frames per second. And I tried to trick it by putting it into the VFR. That doesn't work either. So if I put it at 24 frame and then jump into VFR, it still kind of stops you right at 120 frames per second. So and you may think it's working because you'll turn it on to pixel for pixel and then you'll see 120 frames and 240 frames available. But the minute you select those and you go out of the menu, you'll see that it goes back to full when you select those.
Yeah. Well, cool. Let's see here. Next question we had up here was noise reduction processing. Some reviewers are saying that ProRes has less noise reduction processing than HEVC? Question mark.
Yeah, I read the same article as Cine D. And I think Sean and I have been testing. So we're not going to ever get really confirmation about this from the team in Japan. But it does appear that what they're attempting to do is I think they realize that ProRes is typically an intermediary codec. It's a very large codec. You're not going to usually want to deliver your final files in this codec. I guess if you want to wait an hour, just or two a day for an upload to YouTube, you can start with a ProRes file if you'd like. But we figure that it's coming in to an editing software. And so by not applying as much noise reduction to the file, it allows more freedom for you to be able to do the noise reduction in the computer. Whereas the H.264 and H.265 encoding, those are supposed to be more like deliverable ready files. Even if they're in log, they're a little less work that has to be done in post. Frankly, doing noise reduction in post can sometimes be time consuming. Although the results can actually be better if you can noise reduce in the editing software versus doing the noise reduction in the camera. So that's what I think that they're trying to address with giving you a little less noise reduction in ProRes.
Yeah, cool. Let's see here. Another question. How is the 1080p on the GH6? Is it line skipped from 5.7K or pixel binned, or how is that being created? I embellished.
I keep answering a lot of questions. Do you want to answer that one, Sean, or do you want me to?
No. You can go for this one because honestly, I think you know more about this side of it than I do. If there's something I know, I'm going to jump in and I'll answer it. But
so the sensor's native readout speed is 120 frames per second. That's its maximum readout speed. So anything that's 120 frames or lower originates from if it's a 16:9 capture, it originates from the original 5.7K 16:9 window on the sensor. So you're getting, whether it's 1080 120 or it's 4K 120, it is originating from the 5.7K window. So the 1080 looks effectively indistinguishable from taking a 4K 120 image, putting it on a timeline, and then outputting a 1080 image. They're effectively the same. And we've seen that from multiple reviewers who have said the exact same thing. Once we get beyond 120 frames per second, that's when things get a little more tricky because The sensor can only read out at 120 frames per second, pixel for pixel. So there's going to be some binning that's applied when we begin to go to 240 or 300 frames per second. But this is without question the best looking of these like super high frame rates we've ever done. It completely outperforms the 180 frame per second I see in any of the cameras we've currently released, or the 240 frames per second of the GH5S. So, and that's all the way up to 300 frame. It looks noticeably better, and the 240 will just look stunning. It really looks excellent.
Yeah, I mean that's honestly been my experience with the thing too, is that, you know, having 4K 120 that is legitimately sharp and like clear in how it's actually working just seems to provide much more, you know, flexibility in using that mode in post for, you know, the classic speed ramps and all that kind of stuff. But even the 300 frame per second, I know while you and I were testing the camera before it was released, you know, it was always like kind of crazy going back and forth saying like, dude, look how sick the 300 frames per second look. Like, I can't believe how clear it is or how sharp it still looks. Like, it's definitely, when more people get their hands on it and you start actually playing with some of these files, I'm legit excited to see what some of the users out there produce with way more talent than I think well, at least that I have. I'm not going to speak for you.
No, way more talent, by far more talent than I have. So I was able to use that at my daughter's volleyball game. She's an 8th grade volleyball player, and you know she's doing club volleyball. And the thing that I appreciated the most about the 240 frame is the ability to use the autofocus button on the back of the camera. So that was extremely useful because I'm so used to our cameras not having any autofocus at those kind of frame rates. It was just so much simpler for me to just kind of keep the single point box right in the middle of the frame. And then as I'm following things as they're going around, if the subject is closer to camera, I just quickly hit that AF button and it locked right on. It really worked well for that.
Yeah. All right, let's see here. Let's do the questions. Cliff's asking, can we have a user manual download link? There's not one publicly posted yet. So, excuse me, I'm sure as soon as that ends up getting posted on our support site, people will know it well before we get to the next stream after it gets published. So, yeah. Let's hear. FC's asking, can the GH6 record 2.5 millimeter external mic and internal mic simultaneously into 4-channel? So this is one that I've actually played around with a lot as far as how 4-channel audio works on the GH6, and in order for it to work, you do have to use the XLR1 adapter. So you do need the XLR1 piece on the top of the camera, which of course I didn't put one next to me. So 2 of your channels will be in the XLR1. Your other 2 channels are either going to be the built-in microphones for just kind of scratch ambient sound, so that'll take up the 2 channels, or you would use the 3.5 millimeter in, so the standard mini phone input, for those other 2 channels, which you could then, you know, with a Y splitter, you can split them out to have technically up to 4 individual mic'd up people into this. So yeah, in order for it to work, you have to have XLR1 and use either internal or the 3.5 millimeter. 2.5 millimeter is the remote socket on the grip side of the camera.
You can put a microphone in it if you want. It just won't do anything.
Yeah, right.
So just a note. Keep in mind that there's only one preamp really in the camera. There's the preamp for either the internal mics or the 3.5 millimeter jack. The XLR1 adds a completely different preamp section, and it's actually digitizing the data in the XLR1. So it's injecting a data stream into the signal. But Sean pointed out one option for additional labs, which is to do like a Y splitter. And the problem that you run into there is you only have one level adjustment because it's a universal level for left and right. But I mean, frankly, today there's a lot of companies that, you know, they make lav connections, which, sorry, I'm wearing a lav now, just so you know. And so like the solution I'm using, and I'm not promoting this brand. There's several that are out there that do this, but I have 2 transmitters that work. One of them can be for, you know, another person on camera, and then I have one receiver that's on the camera itself. And so this would give me two different microphones with two different level controls, and that would come in the 3.5 millimeter jack. And then you can use other microphones, into your 3.5s. Into your XLR connections on the XLR1. So I just want to make sure people understand that there's several ways for you to be able to bring in two channels and still be able to adjust two levels at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's hear. Albert asks, can you talk about the lens firmware updates that were released? Yes, we can. That was one of the things that I was actually having ready and prepared. So if you haven't noticed already, 2 days ago, on March 1st, we released a big list of Micro Four Thirds lens firmware updates, which add a couple of really cool things for the cameras in general, or for the lenses in general, but also adds some of the functionality and compatibility updates that you're going to want to have for the GH6 in particular. So you can get those firmware updates at the link that I'm dropping in the chat right now. But to give you kind of an update as to what these updates are, if we look at, say, the 12mm Summilux, which is personally one of my favorite lenses now, there are three main points that got updated with this lens. The first one is that it allows you to do the push AF when you're using 200 or 240 frames per second. So if you don't have this firmware update installed on the lens, when you go to put the camera in the GH6 into 240 and you press the AF on button or half press the shutter, it's not going to focus for you. So you need the update. The other update is that it added the focus ring control. So the 12mm, the 42.5 Nocticron have been added in for linear manual focus control. So you have the updated hardware that's in those lenses are compatible for the new part. But then also for the GH5 Mark II and the GH6, this also refines the AF performance in 24 frames per second. So 24, true 24, like what we talked about at the beginning, or 2398. And you'll see this listed in each of the actual firmware files when you go to download it. We provide a little bit of a change log. So while you're waiting for your cameras to ship, which, like we've said, I'm sure someone's going to ask the question at some point in here. They should be shipping by the end of this month at the latest, from everything I've heard. This is now like the perfect time to get all your lenses firmware updated. They're not just dedicated updates towards the GH6. That linear AF control works on the GH5 Mark II as well, so it's a nice thing to have added. And yeah, the 24 frames per second update between GH5 Mark II and the GH6 is probably going to actually be something that people would want to take advantage of, even if you're not planning on getting a GH6. Yeah. So that's the firmware updates. Let's see here. Aside from USB power, what are the external power options or requirements when using a dummy battery instead of the BLK22? Would the DCC17 also work with the correct voltage, and is it 9 volt? Matt, do you have this information offhand? Otherwise, I can pull it up and actually get the specs.
Yeah. It's on the very last page, the PowerPoint, John. The DCC17, the DCC17 will absolutely work. So if you want to use the DCC17 battery illuminator with the AC10 wall adapter, that'll absolutely work just fine. So if you don't want to use the USB power, you don't have to. Go ahead and use your DCC17. Same exact one that would work on the S5. And I think it's available. There's going to be like two different adapters that would work on like a GH5 Mark II or GH5, because you can use the older version or the 17.
Yeah.
But don't use the old version. Don't use the old version on the GH6. Use the 17.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for the actual AC part of this, the actual plug into the wall side, the specifications for that, as Matt said, you want to look up the DMW-AC10. That is the official, kind of formal AC adapter that we have for the camera. There are a couple of different ones. So This is where, as the brand, I'm going to advise that you buy the brand ones, not third party, because there's no way to confirm whether or not they're putting proper protections in place. And if you overvolt your camera, you could destroy it, and that's not a warranted covered thing. So make sure you're looking at genuine accessories when it comes to power. That's always been my recommendation, no matter what camera you're doing. I don't care what brand it is. Go for, OEM power solutions for the most part.
Well, and I think on the DCC 17, the key here is that I'm sure that there's some third parties that'll fit into the adapter fine, but there's no guarantee it's actually a DCC 17 that's going to deliver the correct voltage. So you may be turning your camera into a GH5 without knowing, because it'll think it's a GH5 battery. It's not going to think it's the GH6 battery. And then all of a sudden, you're not going to get like 120 frames per second. You're not going to get 5.7K options. And so that battery component is pretty important for the camera to know what formats it can actually work with and which ones it cannot.
Yeah. So let's see here. Here's probably a little bit of a harder question. So this question comes from Western Mustache. Cool handle.
Great name.
Says, why did Panasonic decide to not add a battery grip for the GH6? I have my ideas as to why we didn't add one.
Let's be clear. We don't know. We don't really know. So this is going to just be hypothesis from Sean and Matt. So Sean, why don't you go, and then I'll correct you if you're wrong. So we'll
Nice. So honestly, my understanding now is that, with the GH6, as much as I, tout how awesome I think the camera is for stills photography, the vast majority of people that are going to be picking up the GH6 are probably leaning heavier into video and filmmaking production with this. And in a case like that, a lot of times the camera's more often than not being powered by some sort of external supply. That fact, or that kind of idea, combined with the fact that the camera now supports USB PD charge and operation at the same time, and the huge abundance now of reliable 9-volt, 3-amp, kind of external battery power packs, makes it that in a camera like this, it's just not as necessary for an external grip, because power solutions aren't like they used to be, where you had to always focus on just the batteries only. Now you've got things like this, which can be 10 to 20,000 milliamp hour that can power the camera. There's power solutions like FX Lion that makes little nano V-mount batteries that have USB power delivery options on them. So the entire world has kind of changed a bit. Plus, usually the cameras are going to end up being caged and rigged up, and most of the cages are designed based on just the body, not necessarily the body with a grip when you're having properly designed cages. So that's kind of my understanding is why there's not really a grip for the GH6. How'd I do
also,
that?
I think Sean, I think you're 99% there. I think, honestly speaking, it's also a popularity question. How many people actually bought the grip for the GH6 or for the GH5? And, if you don't sell a number of those grips, then you don't recoup the cost that it took you to develop that grip. And so there are times where it just doesn't make financial sense to do a grip. So that doesn't mean we're going to abandon grips for every other camera that we offer. It may just be for this particular camera, the grip just wasn't all that popular.
Yeah, it kind of harks back to and this is me going to be poking fun at ourselves here. This goes back to like the brick that we had for the GH4, though that was a different idea. Yeah, that was a different kind of idea and concept to add SDI, quad SDI to a micro HDMI port and all this stuff. And, truthfully, not as many people ever bought that. So it starts to question, do you make adapters like this? Do you make accessories like that if they're not really going to be the best option? And truth there, I mean, obviously when the GH5 came out, we didn't need it anymore because we were able to do all that stuff internally. And we went to that nice, lovely full-size HDMI, so that made things a little bit nicer too.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Trinity Media asks.
I think we should. Sorry, no, I think we should answer this question about HEIF and AVIF.
Oh, okay. Looks like I missed it. Just a reminder, if you have questions,
okay.
make sure to tag at Lumix Cameras so we can see it. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want people to think we're ignoring it. So obviously there are an abundance of new photo codecs, video codecs. HEIF is a popular photo codec that gives you a 10-bit photo file. It's primarily used on Apple devices. Frankly, I don't know why we aren't supporting HEIF. We have developed our own HDR photo standard that we have been promoting. So cameras like the S1 and the S1H and the S5 get this HDR version of the photo file format. I think some of this probably comes down to there's not a lot of demand for these formats right now. Some of it may be licensing, other issues that are at play for HEIF. I don't have an answer for that. As to why we don't have more advanced compression codecs, first off, I don't know of any video editing software that supports them. So for us to deliver that would then require you to use some sort of a third-party transcoding software to be able to transcode it over to something that's usable. I realize, what you understand that there oftentimes a compression codec is designed for final deliverable because we're trying to cram 100,000 pounds of leaves down the chute of a disposal that can only take like 1,000 pounds of leaves. And so we use these compression codecs for delivery because the deliverable can be smaller and easier and more efficient. The problem is that when we do a lot of compression to the file at the capture end, there's stuff that's lost. That's that. I mean, you will have compression artifacts. And so these more advanced codecs, just because you can fit more stuff in them and have longer recording times, it doesn't guarantee you that it's going to give you a very editable image when you have to work with it. And frankly, there's no guarantee that it's going to even work on your editing software right now. So our goal is to make sure we're delivering. We're the brand that's kind of going the opposite direction. We're trying to give you the least compressed files that we can. So it goes against our philosophy, really. We were really late. I felt like we were fast to get to HEVC in terms of encoding, but even on the HEVC side, we won't do things like a 422 10-bit HEVC file. Some companies are doing 422 10-bit HEVC, and people ask us why don't you do it? And my first answer is, have you tried to edit that? Have you brought it into an editing software and actually worked with it? Because most of the time you're going to have to transcode that file, and it adds extra time. And ultimately, it doesn't deliver an image improvement that's ultimately very meaningful. So we'd rather deliver a file we know is going to work reasonably well on your computer when it comes time to edit it. So most of the time, if we get asked questions about codecs, especially when it comes to video, you can probably just chalk it up to if it doesn't show that it supports that video codec in any sort of editing software, there's a reasonable good chance we're not going to put it into our cameras.
Yeah. I think that's perfectly put. Let's see here. I'm going to combine a couple of these questions because they all kind of have about the same area to do with each other. So the first question is from Trinity Media, is asking about the low light high ISO performance on the GH6 and kind of where it sits between the GH5 Mark II and a GH5S. The second question was, does dynamic range boost have the same effect on dynamic range in natural versus Vlog? And then the third part of this, and you'll see why I'm grouping these together, was with the added dynamic range, does the GH6's dual gain shooting also introduce noise graininess as a use of the 2000 ISO circuit? Where would you say not using it would be right? So you want to take a stab at how this works?
So let's first, I guess we'll start with the first question is what's the usable high ISO of the camera when we're using the DR boost function? So I think the first thing to remember is that the sensor has just a fundamentally different gain structure, even when you're not using DR boost. So I know there's been some reports of lesser dynamic range. obviously take whatever test you're saying, take with some grain of salt. Remember that the GH5 did not have a ProRes option, and the GH5 did not have this less aggressive noise reduction that we have in ProRes. So if you're seeing tests and people are talking about grain in the image, just verify that they were using an apples to apples codec that was H.264 against H.264 or H.265 against H.265 in a GH5 versus GH6 comparison. I think that's very important to understand. Make sure that they're setting the correct ISO settings, because oftentimes we've seen some errors that people made when it came to which ISO they chose. So just keep those things in mind. It's definitely a cleaner sensor even without DR boost, and it's significantly cleaner than the GH5. It won't compete with a GH6 without the DR boost turned on. However, that DR boost function, and this gets into very subjective perception about the product. My opinion is I will take a GH6 over a GH5S all day long at 12,800 ISO. It looks phenomenal. And there's plenty of tests out there where people have shot stuff. Is it Micro 4 Nerds? She did a really interesting test running through the ISO ramp and comparing it to an S5 and a GH5 Mark II. It's shocking how good the system actually works at those higher ISOs. But I don't need her to show me that, because Sean and I have been seeing it for over a month now.
Months.
And we just don't. You just don't run out of ISO range. It almost makes me wonder personally what happens if they would have given us a 25,600, because the 12,800 looks so good. There must be some picture anomaly that happens when we get that high that they don't think is useful to people. But from what I'm seeing, it's freaking awesome, and I would take it over GH5S at 12,800. But again, this gets into perception. The second question was DR boost with like natural picture profile versus vlog. So this is all about, effectively the gamma curve of the image and how the gamma curve is ultimately created in the camera. When we go to a vlog profile, because it's such a gradual rise out, the natural ISO of the camera is just lifted. It's just the way that this works. But DR boost absolutely works in all the picture profiles. You can use Cine like D, Cine like V, natural, whichever one you want. But when we're talking about HLG, which has a more gradual rise from black to white, and we're talking about log profiles, they're going to be ISO 2000. Is there more noise in the file? Again, this really comes down to whether or not I'm using an H.264 file, H.265, or if I'm using ProRes. Typically, if it's ProRes for ProRes, it's going to be really hard for me to see much of a difference between them. I think the image just looks better with the DR boost turned on, even at ISO 800 or ISO 2000, than when I turn it off. But that's just my personal opinion on it. You'll see plenty of people testing this out there, and take a look at what they're seeing. But again, just verify what codecs they're using, because it's very easy for me to shoot something in like H.264 on a GH5 and then shoot that at like ISO 100 and say, well, this has less noise than the ISO 2000 on the GH6, which was encoded in ProRes, and it has a very, very subtle noise reduction algorithm applied to it.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's see here.
There was a third question there. You get me that.
Yeah, there's a third question. The chat has just been like jumping back and forth. So as more questions come in, so I want to make sure I get back to where that point was. Oh yeah, with the added dynamic range, does the system introduce noise as you use the ISO 2000 circuit? Where would you say not using it would be right? So in what scenarios would you say don't use dynamic range boost in real world?
And if using DR boost is wrong, Sean, I don't ever want to be right. I use DR boost all the time.
Yeah.
I won't turn it off unless I have to go to a higher frame rate. Unless there's a reason the only reason I won't use DR boost is because I need to go to a higher frame rate. That's the only time I wouldn't use it. And that's because you can't use it at 120 frames a second or 240 or 300 frames per second. I
Yeah.
don't notice any meaningful disadvantage, drawback, lack of noise. I'm perfectly fine using it all the time. I would, the only one other drawback, if I forgot to bring ND filters, that would probably be a reason. You know, if I didn't have an ND filter, I would probably have to drop down to ISO 250 in Vlog, which is the low point for Vlog without DR boost.
Yeah. Yeah. So ultimately, I mean, yeah, if you want to get the highest dynamic range out of the camera, make sure you have ND filters. Make sure you have good ND filters. Because anytime you're putting glass in front of your lens, make sure it's a good quality one. And yeah, that from my experiences, that the shooting at 2000 ISO in broad daylight with a good quality ND filter doesn't really seem to cause that big of an issue. At least from my eyes, I don't see major noise being added into the image because you're shooting at that higher ISO. Because the overall image just seems to be much, much better.
And remember, you have a full stop more highlight information. So this allows you to shoot overexposed. So if I'm really worried about noise, you know, this is where the concept of ISO really frustrates me to like no end, because there is no such thing as ISO in a camera. Okay. This is gonna, I know this is gonna create a flame war in the comments, I guarantee, but ISO is a construct in these devices. There's not like photosensitive material that lives within the stock here. When we're ramping ISO, we're making gain changes, and the issue is that the photo site at certain points, if it's brighter information that's coming into that point in the photo site, there's no need to apply gain if it's receiving plenty of voltage to begin with. It's when we're getting into the lower midtones and the shadow regions where they're robbed of photons, that's where all of a sudden the gain up creates a lot of noise to use. So that's what's really cool with DR boost, is that it effectively is already gaining up the image in the shadow regions, so that when we capture it, it's much cleaner. And so then you can also, if you want, because you have the extra stop of highlight information, you can go ahead and capture, you know, if you want to have a little more dynamic range, capture 3/4 of a stop or a half stop hot, and you'll still have a little more dynamic range on the high end, and you'll get cleaner shadows even still. But I just don't see any meaningful disadvantage to using this system at all, outside of the frame rate issues and the need to use ND filters.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was going through a whole bunch of these questions. There's a lot of questions asking about the external SSD recording that's going to be coming to the GH6. So I want to preface this.
Sean and I have the same questions, by the way. Sean and I have the exact same questions.
So for the vast majority of the questions that have been asked, you know, about what codecs can be recorded, can you dual record, all those kinds of things, we're pretty much as in the dark as everyone else is with it at this particular point. As soon as we get closer to when that's going to be available and when we're going to actually release it publicly, obviously we're going to talk about it, and obviously that information will be out available for everybody. But in the meantime, that does mean that if you want to be using things like ProRes 422HQ at like the 1.9 gigabit per second that it records at, you will have to use CF Express cards for it. As of right now, the two cards that we've tested and worked with, and, you know, Matt and I have shot around with at least one of them because we don't have the Panasonic branded ones here in the US, is the Lexar one that we're giving away with the pre-order campaign that ends at the end of this month. So if you want to get into the camera and make sure that you've got the right media for it and you're ready to go and you're thinking about getting the camera, get on a pre-order list, because you're getting a 128 gig CF Express Type B card that we know works with all of the modes that we've got in the camera, and what we're planning to put in firmware, for free. So you save yourself $200 if you end up pre-ordering the camera for the media side of it. Outside of that, yeah, as soon as we get closer, we'll let you know.
I do want to give away. So let's give them something. So I'm going to give you a little tidbit, but we can't even verify this tidbit yet. But This is going to be the world's biggest tease, and you're going to be totally disappointed with what I'm actually going to share. There is one cool benefit potentially with using CF Express or an external SSD, and that is the thermal load in the camera will be less because the CF Express cards generate more heat. So getting that outside of the camera, there should be some interesting additional benefits just when it comes to thermal load and how much hotter the camera can operate for ambient temperatures. So that's something I'm personally excited for, is to be able to take some of the thermal load out of the camera and put it into an external device. I think that's a cool feature. Most of you are going to be like, oh, what a letdown. That was a horrible giveaway.
Well, I mean, plus with SSD recording, whether you're using traditional SSDs, you're looking at like NVMe enclosures, typically your cost per gig is going to be a lot less than, actually it's not typically, it's going to be a lot less than it is for dedicated media, whether you're using SD or CF Express. So yeah, Matt and I are equally as excited about this, and we're equally as, at least I'm super excited to see what, the accessory manufacturers make for housings to hold things like SSDs. There's already a ton of cages out for the GH6, so we know that they've got all this stuff ready to go. And there seem to be some pretty cool companies making some pretty cool accessories for holding SSDs externally, so you know that you still have a solid connection to the camera. Let's see here.
On that topic. We do have the screw hole point. We do have the screw point also by where the USB port is. So you'll actually be able to. So as accessory manufacturers start making accessories for this, you can get a USB adapter. I'm sure somebody will make a USB accessory that'll plug in and screw right into the side of the camera, so you don't have to worry about it coming out as well. And we also give you our little device that allows you to kind of tie stuff off and hold it onto the camera as well. So I'm pretty excited to see what people do with that.
Yeah. Let's see here. Two questions that came in. One was, where do we go here? Does the GH6 have focus transition feature that was already in the GH5? Yes, it does, and it's a hell of a lot easier to use now. It's been completely retooled for usability. I actually have my GH6 hooked up here, so picture in picture in picture. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, doesn't let me do it when I have it in this particular configuration, but yeah, the focus transition functionality has been massively massively changed now, to where you set your points using the top three buttons here for white balance, ISO, and exposure comp. So I can go in, make my changes, pick my points, go here, here, and then say we'll do something like super far out of focus for whatever reason. So yeah, like it's massively improved. So now I'm able to just toggle through, click to those points, change the speeds, get them how I want them all set up to. It's pretty slick now, how much easier it is to get in and do all this. Yeah. I had to show the camera feed once, at least on this stream. Let's see here. Is there a full list of frame rates in VFR? Nobody talks about the available slow speeds. I don't know if there's an actual full-blown list that shows every single recording option out there. That's a good question. I know I have one.
Yeah, Sean and I have one.
Yeah, we just have to see if it's something that we can put out there.
Yeah. I tell you what, why don't you talk and I'll check to see if we put one on our website.
Yeah. Let's see here. 35 to 100 f2.8 Gen 1 owner. Is there any hope for these Gen 1 zooms also getting linear capabilities? Truthfully, probably not. Lenses that have the linear focus functionality do require pretty specific hardware in the lens and the information being provided to the cameras, older lenses, before we started doing the new generations of those lenses, typically don't have the hardware that's required to have things like linear focus. They either don't have the precision readout for where the focus ring is. So unfortunately, at some point you do hit a wall as to where hardware won't let you update to the newer versions. Yeah. Sorry about that. Let's see here.
We don't have anything, Sean.
Okay.
We don't have anything. We don't have anything posted. So let's see if we can't get that out. We'll try to figure out a way to get it out for you guys.
Yeah. So let's see here. Yeah, the linear focus part as well, that also goes for the cameras too. If the camera doesn't have the information needed for linear focus control, that's why some of the older cameras don't support it. If the processor we used in those cameras doesn't have the capabilities for it, it's why all the newer ones have it. Not everything can get paired back to older cameras. In fact, it's the exact reason why the GH5 Mark II was created and came out. It has updated internal hardware compared to the original GH5, which allows us to do a lot of these cooler, newer things that we're adding in. So, let's see here. And that particular point that the G9 got linear control, but the GH5 didn't, because the G9 was a newer camera, had a newer processor than the original GH5. That's why it could do subject detection and stuff like that, where the GH5 couldn't. So yeah. Let's see here. Cliff's asking, is NAB still a go-ahead? So far, we're planning to be at NAB. So, unless the world completely falls apart more than it is already, we'll be there.
Sean, did we answer the USB-C charging and powering question that was in the chat?
We touched on it in the earlier conversation about it, but you can loop back to that one, and I'll continue looking for more questions.
Yeah. So just to be clear, we give you a battery charger so you can charge the battery externally. There's a little USB-C to USB cable that comes in the box, and then there's a wall adapter that's a USB adapter. If you plug that into the camera, it'll power the camera. You do have to have a battery in the camera for this to work, but if you have a battery in the camera in there, it will power the camera. What it won't do is trickle charge the battery while you're powering it. But any 9-volt, 3-amp device that's USB PD can power the camera and charge the battery, trickle charge at the same time. So if you want put one in, it's a half charge, and by the end of the day, you'll have a fully charged battery. We make an accessory that you can purchase. It's actually the adapter we give you with an S1 or an S1H. That adapter will actually power the camera and charge the battery at the same time. So that probably more information you needed, but you can absolutely do it.
One thing to add on to that. So I just picked up one of these wireless charging ones for my phone because I wanted a newer one. And something to actually be very, very careful about when you're reading the specs on USB power banks. It has to list that 9-volt 3-amp. It can't just say PD support on there. Because there's different levels of USB PD support. You want to make sure that in the spec somewhere it actually states 9-volt 3-amp. I got this one and it's only 9-volt 2.5-amp. So that means I can't use this one on my GH6 to power and charge. But my other the little tiny one that I have over USB-C only will do power and delivery. So just keep that in mind.
And I think people assume just because I have well, that was not good English. They assume that just because their adapter says it'll do 100 watts or 25 4-volt, 25 volt 4-amp or whatever, they assume that because it can go to those higher voltages, it obviously can support 27 watt. That's not necessarily the case. They may not be offering that 9-volt 3-amp output. So literally make sure that it says output 9-volt 3-amp is an option.
So one of the questions that I did want to get to was asking about the photo and video flipping on the GH6. So if you're going from photo to video, how does the camera operate in this? And honestly, it's I think one of the lesser, we've talked about this before in previous streams, but it's one of the lesser kind of, I guess, realized capabilities that the GH6 has is you have an option in the menu called Creative Video Combined Set. It's a mouthful of a menu option, but it's in there.
Actually, Sean, can you bring it up? Can you actually bring it up?
Oh, yes, I can. Hey, I've got the camera set up. I can do this.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I have to get out of that focus transition. So, there's an option in the camera called Creative Video Combined Set, and it's going to be in the wrench menu. What this option will let you do is go in here and change each of these particular options here. So shutter speed, ISO, and exposure. So all your exposure settings, your white balance, photo styles, metering modes, and even your AF modes. By default, when you take this camera out of the box and put the battery in it, all of these icons are the camera icon, like a stills camera icon. If you are a hybrid shooter or a video shooter primarily, go into this menu and change all of them to the camcorder icon. What this does is this sets it so that you can have vlog set in your video profile, but then when you flip over to photo, you can have it go to standard or, vivid or whatever you want to choose. It also means that like you can have all of those individual settings be individualized between each. So it functions exactly like a true hybrid camera should without needing to power cycle a camera to go between photo or video modes. Yeah, it makes a world of difference. You're not sitting there thinking, why am I still shooting in Vlog? Because again, don't shoot stills, don't shoot raw stills in Vlog. It's not what the purpose of Vlog was for. So yeah, set the camera up like that. You'll have the ability to change all these things and have them independent photo versus video.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see here.
Somebody asked, would we support a third-party battery grip? Sure, why not?
If they could figure out how to make it work, though.
Yeah, I could teach you how to make it work real simply. Just plug it into the USB-C port inside the camera and put a battery in the battery grip, and yeah, sure, why not? It wouldn't be that difficult for somebody to design something if they wanted to. The only question mark would ultimately be, do I want to add like a shutter button and white balance ISO controls? We actually have the command protocols for that over USB-C. The one thing you wouldn't be able to do is supply power from the battery that's inside that grip and have the shutter and all those other controls work. But they could also use the remote port on the side of it as well if they just wanted it for shutter purposes and then not have the white balance. And then you could still power it and then have remote control through the remote port.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about this at all late at night while I'm supposed to be watching my children.
So JC is asking, will the GH6 get Wi-Fi streaming like the GH5 Mark II? And will the GH6 get tether control from Lumix tether software? So we can answer one of those questions. It already has tether support, so you'll be able to use Lumix tether. And better yet, you can actually use up to 12 of them over USB connections to control multiple cameras. Similar to like what you can do with a box camera, but just not over Ethernet. The first part of the question about Wi-Fi streaming and the broadcasting functionality that we have in the GH5 Mark II, unfortunately, it's just too early for us to tell whether or not the camera is going to be getting that or not. But know that, at least from my side, obviously, because of how much streaming I do with the company, I am pushing for it. I want to see it in the camera. And I think, Matt, you may agree, because there's a lot of cool things you can do with the Ethernet functionality that like the GH5 Mark II has.
And even just for Lumix tether, the GH5 Mark II is a more competent tethering camera because we give you access to the full menu function of the camera through Lumix tether. And you can also Lumix tether through Ethernet with that camera, which I think is just a killer set of features. So we will absolutely continue to push for a GH5 Mark II level of streaming functionality for the GH6. But at the end of the day, Sean and I don't design the products, and we don't know if there's like a hardware limitation potentially in the camera.
Let's see here. Cliff's asking, is the XLR module an analog or digital connection to the hot shoe?
It's digital.
Well, digital?
It's a digital. Yeah, it's digital. It's the information is digitized in the module, and then it's sent down into the camera. And it's some weird proprietary format too. They don't give us a lot of information about it. It's encoded into PCM in the camera body itself, but it comes down digitized.
Yeah, let's see here. Let's How's the 13 stops of GH6 Vlog different from the 13 stops of Vlog L on the BGH1? That's one that I don't know.
Well, it's actually 13 and a half. It's actually 13 and a half stops on the GH6, and it's only about 13 stops. It's about a half stop more dynamic range of the GH6. That's if our waveform monitors and luminance spot meter functions to be believed, but people are measuring it that way as well. I think the big thing though is that the shadow regions will look different because again, the DR boost and how it behaves, and then you also just have significantly more resolution out of a GH6 than you'd have out of a BGH1.
Let's see here.
So I'm seeing some commentary about maybe some competing cameras and some things that they're capable of. So I just want to point out a few things about full frame versus micro four thirds that are not completely apparent to everybody who's out there shopping for cameras. So I'm not going to name names. I'm going to try to be very polite in this, but I'd like to point out that micro four thirds has certain inherent advantages when it comes to read speed of the sensor. Okay. So number one, I do realize that you can make a stacked CMOS array. And by putting in a stacked CMOS array, we can get faster readout speeds from a full frame camera. Number one, you're actually taking diode area away in order to add the DRAM that does this. So you are actually impacting its low light sensitivity, number one. Number two, there are no dual gain systems out there in a full frame camera that would be considered a consumer photo hybrid camera. And that's what the dynamic range boost does in the micro four thirds camera. So that is a very unique feature set that required the faster readout speed of the sensor for us to be able to achieve. But there's a lot of things people don't think about, like this sensor is outputting 5.7K at 120 frames per second, which means when I shoot 4K at 120 frames per second, I am getting an awesome looking image. When you compare the cameras that can do 120 frame in full frame, you're either at exactly 3840 wide pixel density, so they don't put as many pixels in, which means it's not going to subsample from 5.7K down, which means you're not getting as sharp an image as you would with this camera. On cameras that have higher resolution sensors, like 45 megapixel sensors, 50 megapixel sensors that are stacked array sensors or not stacked array sensors, those sensors are limited to about a maximum of currently 30 frames per second for the full sensor output. Now, there will be a firmware update to one of those cameras that's promising a 60 frame 8K output. That's still only 60 frames per second. So how are they delivering 120 frame content from a sensor that can only read out at 30 frames per second? They are line skipping and they are binning in order to get the image down to where it needs to be. So you're taking a substantial reduction in image quality with a lot of these cameras when you shoot 4K 120. You are also taking a substantial or at least a notable image quality reduction when you shoot in 4K 60, unless their sensor can currently read out at 60 frames per second. And they super sample it down from that 60 frame readout speed. So I just want to make sure everybody understands, if you're comparing a full frame camera to a micro four thirds GH6 at 24 frames per second, yes, you are going to get better low light sensitivity. You're going to get better dynamic range. I'm happy to sell you S1Hs, S1s, S5s, whichever full frame camera you want. It will absolutely outperform the GH6. Now, the divide will be much closer than it's ever been. It's going to be a heck of a lot closer. But once we start to go beyond 4K 24 and 4K 30, once we start to go into 60 frame, 48 frame, 120 frame, that's where the GH6 really begins to pull away from the pack and produces substantially better looking images. And this is something that I hope you can tell I'm a little frustrated by, that people haven't figured this out yet. It's not an apples to apples comparison. You can't just sit here and say, well, brand X has 4K 120, so why wouldn't I just go with their product? Sure, brand X might have that in a 12 megapixel sensor, and the photo quality is not going to be as good as the GH6. Or they may have higher pixel density than we have, or equal pixel density that we have. They won't give you 4K 120, or they're binning and skipping to get you there, which means you're taking penalty to image quality at 4K 60 and 4K 120. I hope that this makes some sense to people. That sensor's capability to be able to read out 120 frames per second and do it for full sensor output is remarkable. And I wish I could tell you more about the sensor tech that's underlying. It is an amazing achievement that they have done with this particular sensor. I'm extremely proud of what the engineers have accomplished here. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands it's no such thing as a free lunch here. Just because I go to a bigger sensor doesn't mean I'm going to get universally better image quality all the way up through 120 frames. Okay.
You have rallied people in the chat, Matt. Comments like hashtag facts, trust Matt's explanation more than reviewers. Oh man, this is why I love having you on the stream, man.
Well,
just straight again, facts.
I don't want people thinking I'm disparaging full frame cameras. I mean, obviously, we sell them. There's clearly a reason for them to exist. We just have to understand what the design goals of the GH6 were. I mean, Yamane-san, who's the director of our imaging business, he just did an interview with Cine D, and turn on the subtitles and hear what he had to say. We're trying to bridge the gap as much as possible between full frame and micro four thirds. We're trying to take advantage of that faster readout speed of the sensor by being able to use the DR boost functionality. Okay, there's a lot of trickery we're doing with computationals in order to get this camera as close as we can get it to a full frame camera. That was our entire design decision, and then to provide meaningful advantages that you can't do with a full frame camera today. Clearly, we have an eye to the future. We know there will be full frame sensors eventually that can do the trickery that we have in this camera. It's just going to take an awfully long time to get there, or the costs are going to be very high for those sensors. So if you're going to do what we're doing here, your sensors are either going to be really expensive in a full frame camera, or it's not going to be able to do the frame rates we can do.
Yeah.
I think that is. I won't say anything more about that.
That is, I think, probably one of the best kind of explanations I think I've heard about, with this particular platform, why Micro Four Thirds is still here. And it goes to actually probably the last two questions that we have time to take today. And one of those questions, which I think you actually kind of gave a pretty good explanation already for part of it, is Walking with Z's question was, I'm an S1H owner. What does it mean for me knowing that the GH6 can record ProRes internal, but the S1H can't, and it's a more expensive camera? On this one in particular, I think what a lot of us need to, or should, kind of try to kind of understand and realize is that cameras are constantly evolving. Newer products that come out, or everything's constantly evolving. Newer products that come out often will eventually be able to outperform the flagships of previous generations in certain areas. And that doesn't mean that necessarily, one is going to be better than the other. So what the GH6 doing ProRes internal means is that the culmination of the new sensor, the totally new Venus engine and processor that we're using in this camera, have now afforded us the ability to actually do some of these things. Some of the things like ProRes, which may not be possible to do on the older architecture because they were never designed to necessarily do it to begin with. So as far as what your S1H is versus your GH6, you have to look at the overall picture, as Matt was saying. What are the benefits between the two? Are you someone who's going to have a lot more benefit from the ultra-fast readout that the sensor can get you with the higher quality things like 4K 120? Is ProRes that important for your workflow? Then the GH6 may actually be the better tool for you to actually create with. But if you don't need ProRes and you don't shoot at things like 4K 120, and you're shooting in really low light scenarios where the full frame sensor can be your light gathering benefit there, then your S1H is still king of the road for you there. So look at what your priorities are in your current shooting scenario to determine whether or not the new camera is really going to fit the best for your style. Unless you're like a gearhead like a lot of us are and you just want the latest and greatest thing, in which case buy both. So,
and Sean, I think there's a parallel here. Like Apple makes the Mac Mini on the M1 engine, and they still make an Intel-based, much more expensive computer that's a 6-core Intel-based Mac Mini, and it's more of a server class device. It serves a very different purpose than the M1 Mac Minis serve. So,
Yeah.
sometimes we just can't give you everything or have the ability to do firmware updates to correct absolutely everything that a camera might have for a potential shortcoming when a new camera comes out.
Let's see here. A
There's a
couple of
question
the.
here.
Yep. Go ahead.
So, if the sensor is outputting at 4K or 5.7K at 120 frames per second, could you do 5.7K 120 frames per second in firmware update? I mean, if we wanted to make a space heater, possibly. I mean, it's some of this comes down to what the limitations are of the engine, and the engine may not have enough processing power to be able to do that. There may not be enough thermal management in the camera to be able to do that. There could be a lot of limitations that might have to be imposed to be able to do something like that. So the sensor is capable of it. I don't know if the engine is capable of it. And those are the distinctions we need to realize. It's a small camera after all.
Probably just triggered half the people in the chat there about it being a small camera. But, across the board, one of the biggest things with the Lumix lineup, pretty much no matter what camera you're looking at with ours, reliability is one of the bigger things that, you really want to make sure, or that we want to make sure that the camera has. You're able to take it when you put the camera into 5.8K open gate recording for multi aspects of being able to output your projects. You have to know that in a professional environment, it's just going to work. It's not going to end up shutting down on you. I mean, we harp on thermals a lot because just thermals are one of those things that, we've been doing right for so long, I think, with our cameras, that finally now seeing how a camera like the GH6, with how far we're pushing what sensor capabilities are and what the processor capabilities are, and it's still able to actually run nonstop. I mean, I've done, well, not me. There's tests done out independently where they have the camera running for 7.5 hours straight. One of the YouTube channels, they put the GH6 in an oven at 40. I think at the end it was like 43 degrees, and it ran completely with no shut off in thermal. So, a lot of the cool things that happen here. If you watch that interview over on CineD that Yamane-san gave, there's a lot of cool conversations about what this means for the future of Micro Four Thirds and the full frame L mount. These are by no way the last Micro Four Thirds camera, as some like to, sow dissent into the market. These cameras are going to continue to evolve, and the developments that we do in these cameras are going to help support full frame cameras as we move through next generations. So, with that, I think we're already 20 minutes over what we normally do for these streams. So I think I'm going to give
with
Matt.
You and I, Sean.
Yeah, it seems to. But with that, I think I'm going to give the rest of your day back to you, Matt. These streams are always so much fun, and I love just being able to have conversations with everyone here. Everyone loves when you come on these streams as well. It's just one of the more fun things that at least I do for the company. So thank you so much for taking the time, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. I love the interaction. I love the questions we get asked. And contrary to popular belief, we don't always not answer questions because we're trying to ignore you. Sometimes it's just hard to find them because the feed's going by so fast. Yeah. So I hope it comes through. We want to answer your questions. We're here to support you guys, and ultimately we're advocates for you. We're here to advocate to get the things in our cameras that you want. So keep asking the questions, and we'll keep feeding it up.
Yeah. So with that, everybody, we will be back next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. I promise the link will actually be up by the end of day today, unlike this one that got posted a little bit later. And we're going to be continuing the conversations on the GH6. Next week, the idea is to actually kind of talk more about how the GH6 and the Micro Four Thirds lineup sits compared to the full frame system that we have. So we're going to be taking a bigger picture view of what is available from Lumix right now, how the cameras interplay with each other, kind of answering questions across the board from all different areas in Lumix, whether you're point and shoot, Micro Four Thirds, or full frame S series. So make sure to join us for that. If you guys enjoyed the conversation that we had here and you felt that you got something out of it, please consider giving us a like and a subscribe on this channel. It helps Matt and I grow this experience and this platform the more we get the feedback from all of you. If we didn't get to your question today, super sorry about that. There are tons of questions that I know we didn't get to. But don't worry, we are always taking questions in, whether you want to submit them over on lumixlive at us.panasonic.com, or if you leave them in the chat here or drop them in a comment after this video is posted. That will help us form the next couple of weeks worth of content for everybody. Outside of that, again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. This was a really fun stream, and I hope to see everybody next week on Thursday, 2 p.m.